the Jews became degenerate in manners and superstitious opinions before they made any improper change in the external form of religion. For although they had adopted many perverse ceremonies under Rehoboam, yet as the doctrine of the law and the priesthood and the rites which God had instituted continued at Jerusalem, the pious still had the church in a tolerable state. In regard to the Israelites, matters which up to the time of Ahab had certainly not been reformed then became worse. Those who succeeded him until the overthrow of the kingdom were partly like him, and partly, when they wished to be somewhat better, followed the example of Jeroboam, while all, without exception, were wicked and idolatrous. Different changes now and then took place, some kings corrupting the worship of God by false and superstitious inventions, and others attempting to reform it, until at length the priests themselves polluted the temple of God by profane and abominable rites. 9. Now then, let the papists, in order to extenuate their vices as much as possible, deny, if they can, that the state of religion is as much vitiated and corrupted with them as it was in the kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam. They have a grosser idolatry, and in doctrine are not one whit more pure. Rather, perhaps, they are even still more impure. God, nay, even those possessed of a moderate degree of judgment, will bear me witness, and the thing itself is too manifest to require me to enlarge upon it. When they would force us to the communion of their church, they make two demands upon us. First, that we join in their prayers, their sacrifices, and all their ceremonies. And secondly, that whatever honour, power, and jurisdiction Christ has given to his church, the same we must attribute to theirs. In regard to the first, I admit that all the prophets who were at Jerusalem, when matters there were very corrupt, neither sacrificed apart nor held separate meetings for prayer, for they had the command of God, which enjoined them to meet in the temple of Solomon, and they knew that the Levitical priests, whom the Lord had appointed over sacred matters, and who were not yet discarded, how unworthy soever they might be of that honour, were still entitled to hold it. Exodus 24:9. But the principal point in the whole question is that they were not compelled to any superstitious worship. Nay, they undertook nothing but what had been instituted by God. But in these men, I mean the papists, where is the resemblance? Scarcely can we hold any meeting with them without polluting ourselves with open idolatry. Their principal bond of communion is undoubtedly in the Mass, which we abominate as the greatest sacrilege. Whether this is justly or rashly done will be elsewhere seen. See chapter 18, see also book 2, chapter 15, section 6. It is now sufficient to show that our case is different from that of the prophets, who, when they were present at the sacred rites of the ungodly, were not obliged to witness or use any ceremonies but those which were instituted by God. But if we would have an example in all respects similar, let us take one from the kingdom of Israel. Under the ordinance of Jeroboam, circumcision remained, sacrifices were offered, the law was deemed holy, and the God whom they had received from their fathers was worshipped. But in consequence of invented and forbidden modes of worship, everything which was done there God disapproved and condemned. Show me one prophet or pious man who once worshipped or offered sacrifice in Bethel. They knew that they could not do it without defiling themselves with some kind of sacrilege. We hold, therefore, that the communion of the church ought not to be carried so far by the godly as to lay them under a necessity of following it when it has degenerated to profane and polluted rites. 10. With regard to the second point, our objections are still stronger. For when the church is considered in that particular point of view as the church, whose judgment we are bound to revere, whose authority acknowledge, whose admonitions obey, whose censures dread, whose communion religiously cultivate in every respect. We cannot concede that they have a church without obliging ourselves to subjection and obedience. Still, we are willing to concede what the prophets conceded to the Jews and Israelites of their day, when with them matters were in a similar or even in a better condition. For we see how they uniformly exclaim against their meetings as profane conventicles, to which it is not more lawful for them to assent than to abjure God. Isaiah 1:14. And certainly, if those were churches, it follows that Elijah, Micaiah, and others in Israel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, and those of like character in Judah, whom the prophets, priests, and people of their day hated and execrated more than the uncircumcised, were aliens from the church of God. If those were churches, then the church was no longer the pillar of truth, but the stay of falsehood, not the tabernacle of the living God, but a receptacle of idols. They were therefore under the necessity of refusing consent to their meetings, since consent was nothing else than impious conspiracy against God. For this same reason, should anyone acknowledge those meetings of the present day, which are contaminated by idolatry, superstition, and impious doctrine, as churches, full communion with which a Christian must maintain so far as to agree with them even in doctrine, he will greatly err. For if they are churches, the power of the keys belongs to them, whereas the keys are inseparably connected with the word, quote, whatsoever ye bind, unquote, etc. Whereas, on the contrary, they discard from their communion all who sincerely profess themselves the servants of Christ. Therefore, either the promise of Christ is vain, or in this respect at least, they are not churches. In fine, instead of the ministry of the word, they have schools of impiety and sinks of all kinds of error. Therefore, in this point of view, they either are not churches, or no badge will remain, by which the lawful meetings of the faithful can be distinguished from the meetings of the Turks. 11. Still, as in the ancient times, there remained among the Jews certain privileges of a church, so in the present day we deny not to the papists those vestiges of a church which the Lord has allowed to remain among them amid the dissipation. When the Lord had once made his covenant with the Jews, it was preserved not so much by them as by its own strength, supported by which it withstood their impiety. Such then is the certainty and constancy of the divine goodness, that the covenant of the Lord continued there, and his faith could not be obliterated by their perfidy. Nor could circumcision be so profaned by their impure hands as not still to be a true sign and sacrament of his covenant. Hence the children who were born to them the Lord called his own, Ezekiel 16:20, though unless by special blessing they in no respect belonged to him. So having deposited his covenant in Gaul, Italy, Germany, Spain, and England, when these countries were oppressed by the tyranny of Antichrist, he, in order that his covenant might remain inviolable, first preserved baptism there as an evidence of the covenant, baptism which, consecrated by his lips, retains its power in spite of human depravity. Secondly, he provided by his providence that there should be other remains also, to prevent the church from utterly perishing. But as in pulling down buildings, the foundations and ruins are often permitted to remain, so he did not suffer Antichrist either to subvert his church from its foundation, or to level it with the ground, though, to punish the ingratitude of men who had despised his word, he allowed a fearful shaking and dismembering to take place, but was pleased that amid the devastation the edifice should remain, though half in ruins. 12. Therefore, while we are unwilling simply to concede the name of church to the papists, we do not deny that there are churches among them. The question we raise only relates to the true and legitimate constitution of the Church, implying communion in sacred rites, which are the signs of profession, and especially in doctrine. Daniel and Paul foretold that Antichrist would sit in the temple of God. Daniel 9:27, 2 Thessalonians 2:4. We regard the Roman Pontiff as the leader and standard-bearer of that wicked and abominable kingdom. By placing his seat in the temple of God, it is intimated that his kingdom would not be such as to destroy the name, neither of Christ or of his church. Hence then it is obvious that we do not at all deny that churches remain under his tyranny. Churches, however, which by sacrilegious impiety he has profaned, by cruel domination, has oppressed, by evil and deadly doctrines, like poisoned potions, has corrupted and almost slain. Churches where Christ lies half buried, the gospel is suppressed, piety is put to flight, and the worship of God almost abolished, where, in short, all things are in such disorder as to present the appearance of Babylon rather than the holy city of God. In one word, I call them churches, inasmuch as the Lord there wondrously preserves some remains of his people, though miserably torn and scattered, and inasmuch as some symbols of the church still remain, symbols especially whose efficacy neither the craft of the devil nor human depravity can destroy. But as, on the other hand, those marks to which we ought especially to have respect in this discussion are effaced, I say that the whole body, as well as every single assembly, want the form of a legitimate church.